in. Okay. Hey folks, thanks for joining us. We're going to give it maybe 2 minutes or so to let everybody filter in and get settled before we get started here. The chat is turned on, so feel free to say hi. Just know where you're calling from. Actually have a wide range of time zones on these, and I think we're repping that with the speakers today too. Rashmi, it's pretty late for you.
I think it's part and parcel. I'm just too excited. I don't feel like it's nighttime right now. But yeah, it's great to see that we do have participants from different places as well, in case that is the case. I'm super excited that there are so many enthusiasts right now. And I really feel, Kenton, we should probably have background music while people dial in. It's
just some elevator
something to fill the
music. That's a good
yeah.
pick. We should see if Zoom supports that as like a built-in feature for their webinars. Maybe I'll request that. Yeah. For folks just joining us, we're going to give it maybe 1 more minute here before we go ahead and get started. And in the meantime, I will actually launch this poll. We've got just a question on what everybody's background is. We've got probably some Azure folks, maybe some Airflow folks, maybe some of both. Looks like some of both. That's great. Hey, Harsh, thanks for saying hi. Okay. While we're giving it maybe 1 more minute, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our slides here. Okay. Thanks to everybody who answered our poll. This is actually helpful for us for the content we're going to go through today. So great to see that. Okay, we're at 3 after and we've got a lot to go through today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. If this is your first Astronomer webinar, welcome. We're really happy to have you. If you're a repeat attendee, it's great to see you back. I like to start every event by going through a couple of things going on in the Airflow community. There's always a ton going on in Airflow, and we just like to highlight some of the great stuff, and then we'll go ahead and dive into our Azure and Airflow content for today. So a couple of upcoming community events I want to bring up to folks. There's, again, tons of stuff going on in the Airflow community, including events both in person and virtual. If you happen to be in Europe, there is an Amsterdam Data Council meetup that someone from Astronomer will actually be there speaking about Airflow. That is tonight. Yes, today is the 29th. Tonight, it's actually probably pretty soon. So if you're in Amsterdam, maybe you can run over there right after this. And then tomorrow, there's also the virtual Azure happy hour. I think Connor and Rashmi, that is also your event, I believe. So if folks have other questions or want to join again from some of the same content, that is available. We also have a webinar coming up next week on covering the features in the new Astro Q4 platform release. So super excited about that. We will be able to throw all of this stuff in the chat in case you are interested in getting links to join any of these events. And I saw that Connor mentioned there is also a meetup coming up in India, which I was not able to fit on here. So we can throw a link in there as well. In terms of new content, we've got a couple of relevant blogs for our content today that we will throw links to in the chat as well, talking about our new Azure native ISV service. So more to come on that in just a minute. Next, I want to bring up that the annual Airflow survey is open. This happens every year. We like to get as many responses and input from the community as possible. This is run by the open source Airflow project and is designed to as you would think, get feedback from everybody using Airflow. So if you are a brand new Airflow user, or even just interested in using Airflow, but don't already, all the way up to a very experienced user, we would love to have your feedback. This will be open for a couple more weeks. And anybody who who fills out the survey gets a free Airflow certification exam entry. So I will throw a link to that in the chat, and I will also throw, Harsh, I see your question about the certificate offer. I will throw my email in the chat as well. So just send me an email and I will get that question answered for you about that. So let me put those in right now. So again, we would love for everybody to fill out the survey if you get a chance. And let me just grab that link. Okay, that is there. All right, that is all of the community updates I had. So want to go ahead and jump into our content today. A couple of bits of housekeeping before we get started. This is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording as well as some of the content that we go through after the event. So if you want to revisit any of it or send to your colleagues or whatever, you will have that available to you. The chat is open and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please, if you have questions, use Zoom's Q&A feature or throw your questions in the chat throughout. We are all here to answer those. Awesome. So without further ado, jumping in, and we are talking about running Airflow on Azure today. We have a very exciting announcement about our new Astro Azure native ISV service, and we're going to go through kind of everything that you need to know to run Airflow successfully on Azure and orchestrate all of your Azure services. As you can see, I have a couple of guests on with me. So before I dive into the content, I want to introduce these folks. We're really happy to have both of them here. Shmi Sriram is here from Microsoft with us to talk about the Azure side of things. So really excited about that. And then we have Connor Beverland, who's on the product team at Astronomer, who's also going to help talk about this new service. So I don't know if both of you folks want to say any quick introduction here.
I'll just say Rashmi and I are basically partners in crime who built this, and well, with our engineering teams, built this offering that we're going to show you today. So I'm the PM from the Astronomer side who worked on this, and Rashmi from the PM from Microsoft.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So basically, if something goes wrong, you know whom to attack on.
Right.
Always a dangerous
But yeah,
thing to offer, right?
all that put aside, like we are really excited to talk about the product that we have worked together with, and we just recently announced it. So I am sure that after today, most of you will get a crazy opportunity to try it out on yourself and let us know how it works. So yeah, Kenton, I'm super excited. I'm just giving it back to you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. We're very lucky to have you both here. We always love covering new content where we have the folks who are actually responsible for helping to create it on the webinar. So again, I hope any participants today definitely take advantage of that. And again, ask any questions as we go through. For an agenda today, I'm going to start off with a brief introduction to Airflow. In the poll we asked earlier, quite a few of you, almost half, indicated that you are newer to Airflow and already using Azure, which we expected from some participants today. So I want to cover, for those who have not used Airflow extensively in the past, just a little bit of background to kind of ground us in the context. But we'll go through that pretty high level. And then Rashmi will give an overview of Azure native ISV services for those of you who are not as familiar with the Azure side, and that's going to be very relevant for introducing our new Astro Azure native ISV service. Connor will go through a demo of how that works in creating Airflow deployments on Azure. I'm then also going to talk about the Azure Airflow providers, a little more of a hands-on example, and give a demo of how you can actually orchestrate your Azure services once you have your Airflow up and running on Azure. So a lot to go through today. We'll go ahead and jump right into it. So starting off with our brief introduction to Airflow. And I will preface this by saying, if you are brand new to Airflow and haven't used it at all before, we have tons of great getting started resources, including webinars that we've done in the past devoted entirely to an introduction to Airflow. So I will link some of those in the chat a little later, or speak up if you have any questions about that. There's obviously too much to cover just in part of a webinar today, but we have lots of resources available to you if you need those. So Airflow is the open source standard for workflow management. It's a tool for programmatically authoring, scheduling, and monitoring your data pipelines. It's a huge open source project. There's over 16 million downloads per month. The ecosystem around it, which we're obviously going to focus very heavily on the Azure part of the ecosystem today, but is big. Airflow is great for integrating with any number of different tools. There's a huge community, so definitely highly recommend all of you folks join the Airflow Slack. That's actually a great way to get a hold of folks at Astronomer if you have any questions, and there's tons of members there. And actually, I keep forgetting to update this slide. There's well over 2.4 thousand contributors now, but the project is very, very active. Lots of people contribute, so including to the Azure side of things that we're going to talk about today. So Airflow is going strong. It's been around for a while. And again, it's one of the most commonly, frequently used data pipeline tools out there. We won't go through all of these features today, but part of what makes Airflow so popular is that it has a really strong core set of features that make it a great orchestrator for almost every use case. One of the core tenets of Airflow that will be important for the demo that I go through is all of your data pipelines are written in Python. So everything is defined programmatically. You have tons of other features available to you depending on the use case you're trying to implement, things like dynamic tasks, provider packages. I will talk about more as we go through, since that will be relevant for Azure, as well as different ways to schedule your pipelines and monitor them with a fully functional UI and lots of things like that. Airflow is used for pretty much everything. Like if you're looking to schedule it, you can do it in Airflow. The more common use cases that we see are probably exactly what you would think. Lots of ELT, ETL. It's very frequently used for MLOps. Those are both kind of the examples that I have for the demo today. We also see it for operationalized analytics, building and delivering customer-facing applications, all sorts of things. So again, one of the great things about Airflow is that because it's all written in Python, it's super, super flexible, and you can use it for really anything that you need to orchestrate. I will go through just a couple of the core concepts within Airflow. Again, because these are going to be relevant in the demo, it's helpful if you have kind of a basic understanding of some of the terminology. The most kind of core concept within Airflow is DAG. So DAG is just your data pipeline. It stands for Directed Acyclic Graph. You can think about a DAG, again, in that graph as each node is a task and each edge is a dependency between tasks. The rules for DAG are that your tasks flow in one direction and have no loops. So they try to help you avoid infinite loops in your code, which are obviously bad. But otherwise, you can define your pipelines or your DAGs in whatever way makes sense for your use case. So those tasks can be really basically anything. Again, you can think about it as a unit of work. It's best practice to keep them atomic. We will show lots of examples of tasks in our demo today. They might do things like make an API call. They might kick off an Azure Databricks job. We're going to show one of those. They might wait for a file to land in Azure Blob Storage. So sometimes they have special functionality where they wait for something to happen. And then generally a task instance is going to represent a specific run of a task. So for a DAG, for a task, for a point in time. So every time you run your pipeline, you will generate a DAG run that has task instances for all of your tasks. Those tasks are defined again in Python, but Airflow is pretty built out so that you don't have to write your own Python functions for everything that you're doing. This makes it much easier to use for, again, most users are doing kind of the same type of operations within their DAGs. So there are built-in decorators and operators, kind of the building blocks of Airflow. You can think of them, they're essentially just Python functions, but they're like a wrapper around each task that contain the instructions that you want to complete in that task. So some of them are very basic, what you would think. A Python operator is going to run a Python function that you provide. Some of them are very specialized. So we're going to show some of the specialized Azure ones in our demo today, but things like the Azure Data Factory Run Pipeline Operator, which is pretty aptly named, does what you think it would do. Or the Azure Batch Operator, which runs an Azure Batch job, things like that. So this is one of the benefits of having such a strong community that's really big, is that they have contributed a lot of these operators to Airflow. So that if you're saying, I want to, run something in this particular service, you don't have to write your own Python to do that. It's already there for you, and you just can provide the configuration. So we'll show lots of examples of how that works later. Another core concept that's important for our demo today is providers. Providers are separate Python packages, and separate from the core of Airflow, that contain all of the relevant modules. So that's the operators, decorators, sensors that I just mentioned, to interact with a third-party service. We are going to talk heavily about the Microsoft Azure provider today. That's going to contain all of the operators, or again, other modules that are needed to interact with many different Azure services. We will throw a link to this in the chat as well, and it will be in the follow-up materials, but the Astronomer registry is the best place to go to learn about the different providers that are out there and what is contained within them. And then putting that all together, when you actually define your data pipeline, again, your DAG is going to contain tasks. It's pretty basic in Python. Again, just giving this to kind of orient for our demo that we'll go through later. But if you're familiar with Python at all, this will look pretty basic to you. You have some imports. You define our DAG and provide kind of basic information about it. So when you want it to run, when you want it to start, how you want the pipeline to behave. And then you define your tasks, which may be Python that you write yourself. So in this particular case, this one here, that interacts with an API, or they may be using those pre-built operators. So the bash operator is another pretty basic one that obviously runs a bash command. You can set dependencies between your tasks that result in a graph like you see on the left. And then you can go ahead and run this in Airflow. So this is the basic example, again, just to orient for the content that we're going to go through later today in our Azure example. But that's really all you need to know to get started with Airflow. So pretty whirlwind tour. But again, we want to focus today specifically on running Airflow in Azure. And so for the next part, we want to go through, once you have all of those basics down with Airflow, again, Airflow is open source. You can run it locally on your own. Using tools like the Astro CLI. But if you want to actually use Airflow in production, which most folks do, that can get a little trickier. So that's what we are here to talk about today. So Rashmi, I will go ahead and hand it over to you to talk about Azure native ISV services and how that relates to Airflow and Astronomer.
Yep. Thank you so much, Kenton. So I think now that we have the Airflow 101 content, now let's just get what Azure Native ISV Service 101 content looks like. So in the progressive slides, we will be looking at a very high layover of what the service does. And later on, when I hand it over to Connor, he's going to give a demonstration of how this integration actually pans out, right? So going to the next slide, we will understand what exactly Azure Native ISV Services is. So what Azure Native ISV Service, that is the product for which I work for, is we bring a third-party SaaS application into Azure and give them a native solution experience, in the sense that now, if you are using Astronomer on Azure, you do not have to do multiple configurations. You can do it with just a couple clicks. And all this while ensuring that things are still secured, things are being managed easily, and everything is protected in terms of what data you're transferring, right? So these are the key words that I have just picked up from the definition that we have. But to get the gist of it, click Azure, go to Astronomer with just a couple of clicks. And that's what we're going to see in the demo today. Moving forward, we have worked with a wide range of partners in the portfolio that we have right now in terms of different categories like observability, data, storage, networking, whatnot. And in this category is where we have now added the newest partner and the special partner that we're talking about today, which is Astronomer. And how do we fit into this whole picture? How do we make sure that the whole journey goes smooth is a testament to the fact that we already have 14 plus partners, right? And this is not going to be the end of it. If we see further, we definitely have many more partners coming in the line. So we can move forward over here. Awesome. So we have a wide range of customers in terms of like the top SMEs, the top MNCs, which work across the globe. We have them trusting and using their production workload with us on a day-to-day basis. And these are just some of the glimpses of top customers that we have been seeing and working with in the past couple of years. And this is not exhaustive, right? And with Astronomer, we are hoping to grow this journey even further. And that's it. That's pretty much what I would like to talk about Azure Native ISV service. Now, before handing it on to Connor, I want to just give a overlay of how exactly the function works, right? So the diagram that we're seeing right now is a very high layout on what exactly Microsoft does and what exactly the partner does, right? So when a customer is using any of the resources from Azure, they basically interact with Microsoft. We are the middle party, which makes sure that we pick their data, we fetch exactly the right kind of data from the partner to make the connection in order to make it seamless, like having a single sign-on for suppose authentication taken care of, the billing being streamlined from Azure Marketplace. All of these things are being taken care of by us. Also, while providing first-party integrations if needed, like in case of a monitoring tool, you might need things like log forward, or you might need Azure monitoring integration. If you're looking into networking, you might need a VNet injection. All of these things, we work in providing it for the customer, and then we just make the connection with the partner. So now when you're trying to reach out to the partner, you just stay in Azure. You can create the complete resources with all the valid credentials without having to log in the second time, without having to configure these VNet injection, etc. the second time, right? So the control plane stays with Azure. We do the managing. The data plane stays with partner. They take care of the data where it's kept securely, and we do not have any access to the private confidential data that's being used, right? So this is how the overall Azure Native ISV services work. And now I'll quickly pass it on to Connor so that we can go deeper and see the demo.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Just before getting into the demo, I just want to briefly mention what is the thing you're even getting access to when you create an Astronomer Astro org in Azure, which is our managed Airflow offering, Astro. So Kenton mentioned how Airflow is an open source project. You can host and run it yourself. Running it in production can become problematic. Astronomer is the main commercial developer behind the Apache Airflow project, and Astro is our product that we firmly stand behind as the best place to run Airflow. So if you're trying to run Airflow, we think this is the best way to do it. We are announcing in this webinar the ability to create one of these orgs directly from Azure, but this product has been in production on Azure for over a year at this point, and it provides a ton of value-added features on top of the open source Airflow. They're not going to go through this exhaustively, but things like the Astro CLI, which Kenton actually briefly mentioned, this is a really first-class way to develop Airflow DAGs locally and then push those over to our cloud service and ensure they're well tested and are going to run well in production. We have a cloud IDE that lets you build Airflow pipelines, even if you're not that familiar with Airflow or that familiar with Python for that matter, if you're more of a SQL person. It fully supports private networking, including on Azure. So if you need your Airflow to talk to systems that you have on Azure that are in like a private VNet, we can set up VNet peering and things like that. We make it very easy to upgrade Airflow. Like Airflow is a fantastic project. There's a new major version of it coming out about once a quarter. It always has lots of really nice new features. People want to get access to those new features as quickly as possible. And of course, stay up to date with security patches and so on. Astro makes that easy. We even allow you to roll back deployments if there was any problem. So if you ever mess anything up, you can just roll back and get back into a good working state. We provide visibility across all of your Airflows. So Astro makes it really easy to have multiple teams interacting with Airflow, each with their own independent dependencies and not clobbering each other. And we provide great visibility across all of those Airflows that you might have for your different teams in one central place. Airflow natively in the open source supports alerting. We have a centralized alerting system in Astro that enhances open source Airflow's alerting capabilities, providing true task SLAs as an example. And then finally, as the main commercial backer of the Apache Airflow project, you get support from us, like the deep experts on Airflow, if and when you ever have problems. And then in terms of getting going with this on Azure, it's actually really easy. So we're going to drop a link into the chat, so you can directly go to the Azure Marketplace offer that will do this for you. But even if you don't have that direct link, you can simply come into the Azure portal. You can search for Airflow. You'll see our new service show up there. If anyone is logged into Azure, by the way, feel free to actually just do this yourself as we go. What this is going to get you access to is an Astro org where you will initially get $300 worth of credits. So it's free to get started and try it out and check it out. All I need to do is create an org. There's a few fields to fill out here. I'll walk through them. It's all fairly simple. I have to pick the Azure subscription that I want this resource to belong to and for any billing usage information to flow to. In my case, this is my personal Azure account that I'm testing with. I just have one subscription. You could have many potentially. You also pick a resource group. Again, I happen to only have one, but you could have multiple. Resource groups are just a good way of collecting Azure resources together so that you can see like all the billing for a certain project in one place and things like that. The next thing I do is pick a resource name. You might say something like Astro or Airflow or whatever makes sense to you. Since we're doing this webinar, I'm going to call it Azure Webinar. I pick the region in which the Azure resource that I'm creating here will live. It's currently the case that East US is the only option I have. We're going to be adding multiple additional regions in the next couple of weeks. I do want to mention here that this is the region where the Azure resource lives. Like Reshmi mentioned, that control plane. The data plane where your actual Airflow instances live is controlled within your Astro org. It already supports multiple regions. So your actual data can be in many regions, Europe, Asia, and East US as well. You pick your Astro organization name as well. I'm going to use the same one here, Azure Webinar, but typically this is going to be like the name of your company. In Astro, we have the ability to support multiple workspaces. This is, I'm just going to use my name here as the default one. This is a way of organizing your workflows. I mentioned you could have multiple teams using Airflow, all working independently of each other. Workspaces are a great way of organizing those teams. Like each team can have its own workspace with their own development Airflow, staging Airflow, production Airflow, and so on. You need at least one, and I'm just going to pick Connor as my initial one. Then in terms of billing, I'll just briefly show this. There's just one plan at the moment, so there's no choice to make or anything, but it's pretty simple. You only get charged for things you're running. Like if you create an Astro org and you don't deploy anything into it, you don't run any actual Airflow in it, there's no charge. The charges only come when you're actually doing it. And in addition, like I mentioned, you get $300 of credits to get started. And if you want more details, you can check out our pricing page and it will show you exactly how that works. Optionally, you can add tags. These are an Azure concept, again, for tracking like billing information, typically. Like I'm tagging all my resources for a certain project in a certain way so I can see the total costs. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and create. This will take a couple of minutes to create my resource. So while we're waiting, I'm just going to hop over and explain what this is doing for me when it's creating. So one of the really nice things that it's doing is it's creating me an Astro org that already has my SSO set up with my Azure login. So I don't need to create a new user in Astro. I don't need to set a password. I can just go straight in with my current Azure login. Any billing, as I mentioned, is going to go through the Azure Marketplace to that subscription that you picked when you created the org, and you get 300 credits to get started. If you happen to have a committed spend with Microsoft, like an agreement that you're going to spend a certain amount on Azure over the coming, X number of years, any usage of this Astro product that we're showing here today will count against that for you. So it will help you reach that target that you agreed with Microsoft. And in this demo, I'm creating a single Astro org. It is possible and it's no problem if you have multiple different subscriptions and you want like team A's billing to go to their subscription and team B's billing to go to their subscription. You could create multiple orgs with different subscriptions, and that's no problem. All right, looks like we finished over here. So we've created that resource in Azure and I can now go to it. This is really just a simple placeholder for my Astro organization. I have a link here to go to Astro. It's great to bookmark this link and even give it to others in your company. This will take you straight into the Astro org without having to type in your email or anything like that. You can also go to the regular Astro login page and type in your email, and it would redirect you over to Azure to log in. But with this special link, it just takes you straight in. We have other webinars that will show you a lot of details of like how to really get started here, which we're not going to focus on today. But basically, once you're in, it's very self-directed of what to do. The first thing is to create a deployment. It's going to be on Azure in this case. As I mentioned, there are various regions that you can pick. If you do need private networking, like I mentioned, you're going to need a dedicated cluster for that. And for dedicated clusters, there's a whole bunch of regions available today. And that is pretty much it. One other thing I thought it would be worth mentioning, and I'll drop a link to this in the chat. Because of the automated SSO setup that I showed, we don't directly support the SSO for emails like Outlook.com. But you can, if you are using a personal Azure account, as I was when I just set up that org, it is possible. You just need to make a special user within your org to do it. So I'll drop this link if you want to try it out. All right. I'll pass it back to you, Kenton.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor, for going through that. I think that your that doc you just shared probably answers that question in the chat. But for those who have asked questions, some of them I am leaving because they're going to be answered as part of the demo. So don't worry, we will get to them at the end if we haven't addressed them as part of the presentation here. And I did forget to mention earlier, sorry about this, but Zoom will default your chat to send messages only to hosts and panelists, which means only the three of us can see them. So if you change those to everyone, then everyone will be able to see the messages. So a little Zoom quirk there. All right, so let me go back to my screen here. Okay, so now that that Connor has shown how you can really easily get started with the Astro ISV native service, I want to show a practical example of what you might do next. So if you have Airflow running on Azure, now how can you use Airflow in Azure and the Azure provider to orchestrate your Azure services? Before I dive into the demo, I want to give a little bit of background on how this works. So before, I briefly defined Airflow providers, which again are Python packages that provide all of the necessary hooks and operators to interact with a third-party service, so external to Airflow. The Azure provider has over 50 different modules for orchestrating various Azure services from Airflow. These cover a lot of the most commonly used Azure services. And again, some of them get pretty specific. So these are designed to make it easier for you to integrate these things into your pipelines. We will throw a link to this in the chat as well, but you can learn more about all of these on the Astronomer registry, which again, will just detail what all of the available modules are and how they work. For this example in particular, I want to talk a little bit about using Azure and, Airflow and Azure Data Factory together. This is one of the most common use cases that we see from Azure users because it allows you to leverage kind of the ease of use and integration with other Azure services that Azure Data Factory brings, as well as using Airflow for kind of that best-in-class orchestration. So we're going to center our demo today around using these two tools together. Often teams who are starting to use Airflow already have ADF pipelines and don't want to rewrite them, or maybe they need to integrate with other tools outside of Azure in addition to their Azure services. Airflow is a great addition there. I saw a question in the chat on kind of the Airflow service built into Azure Data Factory. So I think I'm going to touch on that throughout, and we can address that at the end as well. But again, this is a really frequently used combination. So that's part of why we're centering this demo around that today. So for this example, I'm going to show two pipelines for implementing an ETL and ML use case in Azure. The first is going to be kind of a standard ETL DAG that manages a couple of ADF pipelines that move data around from Azure Blob Storage, do some transformations on it, and load it into Microsoft SQL Server at the end. The idea behind a pipeline like this is that if you are going to run some sort of ML ops or productionized, ML pipelines, you need the data available to you in the first place. And typically there's maybe another team within your org that's managing all of that. So that's what our first pipeline does. The second one is going to be a more standard ML ops pipeline that again is going to manage an ADF pipeline and Azure Databricks to do the feature engineering and actually run our model and predictions. This particular one predicts credit scores based on customer data. So again, this is going to show, this example is pretty ADF heavy since we see that use case a lot. That's definitely not the only way you can integrate Airflow with Azure services. And in some of these cases, there are even multiple different options. Again, depending on kind of what your starting point is, how you want to integrate those tools. And what you're looking to do. So I will go through all of the code for this and actually how it works in a minute. But to start, the first step whenever you're using Airflow for orchestration of any other service is making sure that Airflow can actually talk to that service. So if you've already used Airflow, you may be familiar with setting up connections in the Airflow UI so that your Airflow operators can talk to whatever other tool you're trying to orchestrate. In the case of this Astro native ISV service, this is actually quite a bit easier than filling out connections in the UI. Or if you're familiar with Airflow, connections are a universally tricky topic, and we've tried really hard to make that easier in this case. So Astro on Azure comes with enhanced authentication capabilities that are going to allow you to leverage Azure workload identity to access any Entra ID protected resources. So this means Rashmi touched a little bit on how this works before, but this means when you set up workload identity in your Astro deployment, you won't need to manually manage credentials or use passwords in your Airflow connections. So I'm not going to demo configuring workload identity today because it just takes a little bit of time to set up on the back end, and you do have to grab some credentials for that. But the screenshot here shows how you can start the process from within Astro. So once you have a deployment set up, like Connor showed earlier, you can set up workload identity within that deployment. We have a blog post that will detail how this all works. I think we can link that in the chat. But then assuming that is done, we will go ahead and hop over to my other tab that Zoom is blocking. Sorry, guys. They get the Zoom window to go away, not that one. This one. Okay. Here we go. So this here is our Astro deployment. Again, this deployment is running on Azure. So this is assuming you've gone through the process that Connor showed earlier. You've set up your native ISV service. The next step is to create an Airflow deployment. Connor showed that a little bit earlier. That's a super simple form that you fill out. Just takes a minute. We have 2 already running here. And for this example, we're going to look at our production Azure deployment. So we can see the cluster here. This is running on Azure in that West US 2 region. And we get a little bit of insight into what's happening in our Airflow here just from the homepage. And again, so the next step before we are going to run any pipelines that connect to Azure is to get all of that authentication set up. So we need to set up a connection. Again, rather than doing that in the Airflow UI, we are going to take advantage of that workload identity that is set up on this deployment and our new Astro connections management feature. So this is going to allow you to create connections once and share them to multiple Airflow deployments within your Astro workspace without having to set up your own secrets backend. So again, massively simplifies kind of how this works. And you have much less to do in terms of managing credentials. So in my deployment here, the way that works is I can go to environment and I can go to add connection. If I search for Azure, you're going to want to choose the one that has managed identity here. And notice here, I can give my connection an ID, and then I provide my managed identity client and my workload identity tenant ID. Both of those you will get as a result of going through those steps that I showed in the screenshot earlier and that are detailed in our blog post. So we'll have documentation on how all of that works. But you'll notice I never have to put in a password here. And then this is going to be used by all of my Azure services. So I have already set this up in this environment. This is my Azure Con here. So we'll see that this is going to be used, again, heavily in our example pipelines. So now that our environment is all set up, let's go ahead and look at the pipeline. So we can go to open Airflow here. This is going to take us to the Airflow UI. If you are familiar with Airflow, this is going to be very similar to what you would see with the open source Airflow UI. It's designed so that there's not a big learning curve here. It's going to work just the same as it would there. And I have my 2 pipelines running here. So I've got my Azure Services DAG and then my ML with Azure. So we'll go through the ETL one first. Again, looking at this DAG, let's look at the graph here. So this is showing me my recent runs. This pipeline is running. You can see I have 3 main tasks here after our little start task that just helps us kind of organize the flow. Again, these are all running Azure Data Factory pipeline. So the first is going to ingest some data, then we have a transformation step, and then finally we load that data into a SQL server so that it can be used downstream by our ML DAG. Again, in this particular scenario, we're assuming that you might already have Azure Data Factory pipeline set up to manage all of this. So this is kind of bringing data out of Azure Blob Storage, doing the transformations, and then loading into Microsoft SQL Server. These are things that Azure Data Factory is great at. It's already set up to integrate with those other Azure tools. The benefit of Airflow here is getting this kind of higher level orchestration of those services. So we can see everything in one place. We can connect our pipelines together with dependencies here, and we can also make them a little more dynamic. So you'll notice on this ingest data task, there's these little brackets and a 3 here. You'll see in the grid view over here, I also have, make this a little bigger, also have the brackets here. This is indicating that this task is dynamically mapped. So Airflow has the capability of adding in a dynamic factor to your tasks at runtime. So if you say want to make a copy of a task, in this particular case for say different data sources, but you don't know ahead of time or how many data sources there are going to be, or they might change with every pipeline run, you can easily build that into your pipeline. So, and that means that will, your DAG will adjust each time it runs to whatever that external criteria is. So another benefit of using Airflow there. If we take a look at the code for this DAG, it's pretty straightforward. So again, this is going to look just like the basic example I provided earlier. We have our imports of all of our packages. And notice we're using this Microsoft Azure provider, and then we're importing a couple of different operators. In this case, we're going to just use this Azure Data Factory run pipeline one. We have some default arguments that determine kind of how the pipeline works, just how we want it to run, and then define our DAG. So again, this is just basic information about scheduling the pipeline and how it's going to behave. And then we go ahead and define our tasks. And again, because we're using a pre-built operator here, there's not actually a lot of code that we have to define. It's mostly configuration. So the Azure Data Factory run pipeline operator is already pre-built to send the request to Azure Data Factory to run the pipeline, wait for that pipeline to complete before moving on to the next task, and wait for a success, or however you want to trigger the tasks in your DAG. So within each of these, we're providing a task ID, which is just for Airflow purposes. We're providing the connection. So again, that's the one that we set up for our entire Astro environment, that Azure con there. We provide the resource group and the factory name. Those are both set up on the Azure side. And then obviously the pipeline name. So this is what you would see within Azure. For this first one that's doing the ingest data, this is the one that we've dynamically mapped. So you can see we add two functions to the operator call. We have this dot partial. These are parameters that are staying the same for each copy of the task. And then we have this dot expand. So this is the one that it's going to map over. So in this case, we're actually creating a copy of this task for every pipeline that we pass here in this list. In this particular case, the list is static, so we've obviously hard-coded it in. We've got a couple of different pipelines that are bringing in data. This doesn't have to be hard-coded, so this could be information that you're bringing in either from a call to some other service, so maybe an Azure database to get this list. It might come from an upstream task or a task in another pipeline, anything like that. And again, that's just going to give us a couple of different tasks so that we have more kind of atomic management of what's going on there. And then finally at the bottom here, we just define dependencies. This is super easy in Airflow. We can just use these bit shift operators. And again, this is going to give us full control over when these pipelines are run, how they're run, and give us this kind of pane of glass into what's happening in all of our Azure Data Factory pipelines. The last thing I want to point out here, and actually I'm going to go back to the homepage to do this, is in this particular example, so we have our, again, services DAG that is going to orchestrate these services that are getting our data ready to perform our MLOps pipeline on it, so manage that machine learning pipeline. That's the one here. Most times with this, like if you're going to train a model in a pipeline that runs, you don't want that model to run before the data has actually gotten there, right? So it's somewhat problematic to schedule them, say every day at midnight when the data may or may not be ready at that point, and you have to be in this constant state of rerunning. You might be training on bad data, any of that stuff. Airflow also has a feature to help you manage that, which is another reason to layer Airflow in on top of something like Azure Data Factory or whatever else you are using to orchestrate your services. In this case, we're scheduling based on Airflow data sets, or you might see that referred to as data-driven scheduling or dataset-driven scheduling. You can see here in our homepage on our schedule for the Azure Services DAG is every day at midnight. But for this ML with Azure one, it says data set. And on this Azure set is the name of the data set. This is something we can define in the pipeline. So this is basically our way of saying we don't want this ML with Azure DAG to run until this other one has completed, because the other one is the one that provides the data. If we look at the data sets view in Airflow here, we will actually see this dependency. So here's our Azure Services DAG. We've defined the data set here as this Azure set. And then this ML with Azure and DAG or pipeline is dependent on that. So we can see this dependency set here. Within the code, this is super simple to define. In the code for our first one, we define a data set. So there's this data set object that you import from Airflow. And again, we've called it Azure set in this case, in our example set. And then you can actually indicate which specific tasks update that data set. So in this case, we've set it as the last one here in our pipeline that loads the data into SQL Server. So that's where the data is going, and we define that as an outlet. Then in our next tag, so our ML with Azure, we can define that same data set and we can schedule on it. So in this particular case, again, we have upfront our example data set, our Azure set here. And then in our DAG, when we define the schedule, we just provide that data set. So that means that this DAG is not going to run until that data set has been updated. In this particular case, we just have one task that's updating that data set. You might also have multiple. So in this case, you might have other pipelines that come in that also interact with that data that you need to schedule on as well, and you can do that. So the rest of this pipeline is also pretty straightforward. Again, this one is using this Azure Data Factory run pipeline operator to do our feature engineering, and then to do our to run our model, which is set up in Azure Databricks. So if I could get the zoom to go away, I think I do have that somewhere up here. But this one, in this case, Azure Data Factory is another example of why you might use this. So Azure Databricks, there is not a specific operator designed for that service. There may be later, like these things are being added all the time. But in this case, we just use Azure Data Factory as the intermediary to make that super easy. So again, pretty straightforward in the code here. You can notice that this little icon here means that this was data set triggered. So this pipeline will wait until that other one runs. If we go back to the DAGs, you can also see that the next run, it will tell you which data sets it's waiting on. Okay, so I think that is all I wanted to show for the example. Again, this is just kind of scratching the surface in terms of what you can do with the Airflow and Azure provider. You have tons of different options here, depending on what your use case is and what Azure services you're interacting with. We will provide the code for this example. So if you want to run this and try it out yourself, you can definitely do so. It includes even the Azure Databricks notebook that we run here. So you can try this whole example yourself, but definitely recommend checking out the registry as well for other options kind of within the provider. So I think that was it for our demo. So from there, we can open it up to any Q&A. I see lots of activity in the chat. I don't know if you guys have been answering questions already.
We have answered a few. I'm not sure if we missed any. I don't think we have.
Okay.
I think Connor's doing a great job. I literally just have to see the answers.
That's great. Okay. Let's see. Someone asked if we can see the Cloud IDE. Yes, we can pull that up real quick. So Cloud IDE is another feature within Astro that you can use for writing DAGs. So I showed the example of kind of all of the Python code that goes into them. You can obviously write your own Python files to create those DAGs, which is the traditional way of writing pipelines, and how you would work with open source Airflow. Astro has another option called the Cloud IDE that allows you to do this in more of a notebook interface. So I'll just create a new project here and add a pipeline. Oops. Without a space. So if you are less familiar, especially with Airflow, this can be a great way to get started. You can add a cell, so like the Azure Data Factory run pipeline operator as an example that we were just looking at. If I want to build a pipeline with this, I can just add that in here and it will tell me the information that I need to put in terms of that configuration. So I can enter in a pipeline name, my resource group, the factory name. This will convert your pipeline to code under the hood. And then you can deploy this to your Astro deployment. So it's just another way of developing your pipelines. It can be especially helpful if you're doing more iterative development or if you're writing your own Python functions. Some people prefer it for like the traditional operators like this as well, but if you were going to do your own Python functions, I find, at least for myself, like a lot of people will develop those in a notebook so you can sort of iterate on them, and this makes that a little easier to do within the context of Airflow, so you don't have to move from a notebook then into an Airflow diag. Hopefully that answers that question.
There were a couple of questions that came up. So Pavel asked about the pricing. I have not looked in detail at the difference in how it is priced. So Azure Data Factory's managed Airflow does have a pricing page, and we have a pricing page as well. We haven't done a really like careful analysis of the difference between the two. What I can say in general is we're pretty price competitive. Like we have a lot of customers coming to us from other managed Airflow offerings. And I'm sure you know, more than just ADF as well. And generally, we're fairly price competitive. I'll put a link to our pricing page in here as well. The environment feature that is in preview is, Kenton showed that in the demo. That is an ability in Astro. It's starting with connection management. We may extend it to other aspects of your environment that you want to manage. But basically what it lets you do is define your Airflow connections in one place and then reuse them for different deployments. Like if you have, if you're spinning up multiple Airflows for like, you know, an Airflow deployment for a particular feature branch that you're working on, you don't need to recreate all the connections again from scratch. You can just use the connections directly from Astro that you've already predefined. So we're basically trying to really simplify the management of connections in Airflow. The other thing that it does is like kind of curates the connections for you. So there's less need to do Google searches or ask Astro bot questions about what are the exact parameters needed for different types of connections.
Yeah.
And Jeff, there is no price difference. One thing that you may or may not already know, like during this year, so it's not brand new. It's been 6 months or so at this point, but Astronomer did change its pricing quite significantly. There's no, and to the benefit of the customer, like it was a great change. There's no difference between the Azure managed one and our regular one. The only difference is really like sort of touched on in the demo. If you do have a Azure Mac, a commitment, then onboarding that via Azure consumes or helps you consume that credit, but the pricing is the same. Let me just grab that pricing link and drop it in.
Jeff, to answer the second question that you have asked, we currently don't have a story because we have just gone live with our support for Azure plus Astro as a solution. But this is something we are definitely having in our radar, and we will be working towards having some sort of migration, easy migration, so that people can just like pick their existing resources and move it. But yes, the catch that we have over here is, given that we are talking about an Azure plus Astro integration, the cloud that we're expecting you to have your data in is Azure. So if you're talking about migration from a different cloud to Azure, I think that's a second level of story, which we can definitely look into. But right now, the first level of story that we'll be probably looking into is for someone who already has the data in Azure, how do we bring their existing data and move to the native integration that we have? Connor, by the way, I see that there are some couple of questions in the Q&A button at the bottom. I think they are more addressed towards Astronomer, so maybe Kenton or Connor, one of you can pick them up as well.
Okay, yes, I hadn't seen those.
Yeah, I think in the Q, so I'm taking care of the questions in the Q&A, although Victor, I do see your question on a docs link for this on the Astronomer website. I'm not sure if you're referring to the new service, which I pulled up this slide. The QR code will take you
I
to
think
the link to get
I,
started.
I think Victor was asking about the workload identity stuff.
Oh, I see.
I think, and that is literally brand new. So it was just released in the most recent version of the Azure provider. And there was more doc coming, like the blog. I see Peter is actually here and answered a question. That blog I shared, the link to is Peter's blog. That just went live today. So yeah, there's more to come there.
Awesome. And I think we're out of time, but we did have one more question on whether you can deploy existing Airflow Docker images into Azure on Astro. And I think the answer to that is it depends what your existing Docker image is. So running Airflow on Astro does use our Astro runtime, which is an image that will pull and determines kind of the Airflow version that you're using, and we pre-package some other stuff in there with it. You can customize that Docker image. So we have lots of customers who do that. And we have documentation on how to add that in. So there are obviously some limitations in terms of what you can do on a managed service versus just running by yourself. So it depends on what you're doing in that Docker image. But I'd say anytime you're running on Astro, you're going to be using our runtime Docker image, which is based on open source Airflow. So that's what I demoed. And if you have, customizations within that, things like plugins or running other containers, stuff like that is generally possible. Hopefully that answers that. Okay, well, I think we are at time. Lots of great questions there. Thanks everybody so much for joining. Again, we will be sending out all of the links that we talked about today, as well as the code that I went through if you want to try an example. I hope you all try that on the new Azure ISV service. That's the easiest way to get started. And yeah, definitely reach out from there if you have any additional questions. So Connor and Rashmi, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you both on to talk about the new service, and we're really excited about where this goes moving forward.
Thank you. We were excited to be here.
Likewise.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Have a good day, y'all.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye.